An arrogant federal agent believed he had an easy case. It was a story he had seen 1,000 times, a narrative etched into the very linoleum of the processing center floor. Here was another nameless man, another undocumented shadow to be cataloged, processed, and expelled from the country with the indifferent efficiency of a factory assembly line. The agent, a man whose ego filled his uniform more completely than his body, had laughed a booming, contemptuous laugh when the quiet man claimed he had served 10 years for this very country. The laughter echoed off the cinder-block walls. It was a sound that would soon curdle in his throat, a memory that would haunt him, because that laughter stopped the moment the Pentagon made a phone call that did not just interrupt his day, but shattered his entire world. The air in the ice processing center was a sterile cocktail of bleach, stale coffee, and a faint underlying metallic tang of human despair. It was an atmosphere designed to strip away identity, to reduce individuals to case numbers and files stamped with bold, red letters. Removal. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed a constant, monotonous drone, casting a flat, unforgiving glare on everything and everyone. The light was merciless, exposing the weariness in the faces of the detainees slumped on hard plastic chairs and the bored, institutional cruelty in the eyes of the agents who moved among them. The room was a purgatory of beige walls and gray floors, a place where hope came to die under the weight of bureaucratic procedure. Every sound was sharp and unwelcome, the heavy thud of a rubber stamp, the screech of a chair leg against the floor, the clipped, impersonal cadence of an officer calling out a name that would soon be forgotten. In the midst of this calculated dehumanization sat a man named Marco Reyes. He was an island of stillness in a sea of anxious motion. To the casual observer, he was utterly unremarkable. He wore simple, worn jeans and a faded gray t-shirt that had seen better decades. His face was a roadmap of sun and hardship, etched with lines that spoke of labor under a harsh sky, not of combat in a forgotten land. His hair was neatly trimmed, a detail that seemed out of place in his current predicament. His hands, resting calmly in his lap, were calloused and thick, the hands of a man who worked with tools and earth. There was nothing about him that screamed for attention. He was quiet. He was unassuming. But beneath that placid surface there was a core of unshakable granite. His eyes, dark and deep-set, held a peculiar emptiness. The 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen the horizon of human experience and had come back changed. He did not fidget. He did not sigh. He simply sat, breathed, and waited, his posture a subtle, unconscious echo of parade rest. Striding through this domain of quiet misery was Agent Carl Davis. Davis was a man molded from arrogance and cheap authority. His crisp, black uniform was stretched taut over a burgeoning gut, a testament to a sedentary life spent wielding power over the powerless. He moved with a heavy, deliberate swagger, his polished boots thudding on the floor as if to announce his own importance with every step. His face was perpetually flushed, his jaw set in a permanent sneer of condescension. He saw the people before him not as human beings with stories and families, but as a pestilence to be cleansed, a tide to be turned back. His voice was his primary weapon, a loud, booming instrument he used to belittle, intimidate, and assert his dominance. He was the king of this small, squalid castle, and he reveled in the fear and deference his uniform commanded. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Marco Reyes. Another one. Just another piece of paperwork standing between him and his lunch break. He gestured with a flick of his thick wrist. "You, Reyes. My office. Now." Marco rose without a word, his movements fluid and economical. He followed Agent Davis into a small, glass-walled office that offered the illusion of privacy but the reality of a fishbowl. The air inside was even more stale, thick with the scent of Davis's overbrewed coffee and self-satisfaction. Davis flopped into his large, squeaking office chair, the leather groaning in protest. He gestured toward a small, hard metal stool on the other side of the desk. It was a deliberate power play, placing Marco several inches below his own eye level. Marco took the seat, his back remaining straight, his gaze steady. Davis picked up a file, flipping it open with a dramatic flourish. He scanned the top page, a smirk already forming on his lips. Reyes, Marco. Date of birth? Well, let's just say a while ago. Place of birth? Chihuahua, Mexico. No valid visa. No green card. Apprehended at a traffic stop for a broken taillight. Looks pretty open and shut, eh? Davis leaned back, steepling his fingers over his stomach. His tone was conversational, but laced with a venomous brand of mockery. So, Marco, tell me, how long have you been enjoying our country's hospitality without permission? He was baiting him, looking for a reaction, a flicker of fear or anger he could exploit. He wanted the man to beg, to plead, to offer some pathetic, fabricated story he could tear apart. It was his favorite part of the job. Marco's eyes did not waver. He met Davis's gaze directly, a feat that seemed to momentarily surprise the agent. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and even, devoid of any accent Davis might have expected. It was the voice of a man who chose his words with care. I have been here for 15 years. Davis chuckled, a short, barking sound. 15 years, a long time to be looking over your shoulder, and in that time, what have you contributed? Let me guess. You've done jobs Americans won't do, right? Picked some fruit, washed some dishes, mowed some lawns. The questions were rhetorical, each one a small, sharp jab intended to diminish him. Marco remained impassive. The insults seemed to slide off him like water from stone. He took a slow breath, the only sign of any internal process. I served, he said, the two words falling into the stuffy office with the weight of lead. They were simple, direct, and utterly unexpected. Davis froze for a second, his smirk faltering. He leaned forward, cupping a hand to his ear in a gesture of exaggerated disbelief. I'm sorry, what was that? I must have misheard you. It sounded like you said you served. He dragged the word out, twisting it into something absurd. That is correct, Marco replied, his voice gaining a new layer of firmness, a quiet insistence that defied his circumstances. I served this country for 10 years. The dam of Agent Davis's professional composure broke. He threw his head back and roared with laughter. It was not a sound of mirth. It was a weapon of humiliation. The sound was so loud that heads turned in the main processing area. Agents looked over, some smiling, sensing their boss was on a roll. Davis slapped his hand on the desk, the impact rattling a penholder. Oh, that's rich. That is priceless, he bellowed, his face turning a deep, blotchy crimson. He wiped a tear of manufactured glee from the corner of his eye. 10 years. You served 10 years. He stood up, his large frame filling the small office, and pointed a thick finger at Marco. You listen to me, amigo. I've heard every lie in the book. I've heard sob stories that would make a statue weep. But this takes the cake. He leaned over the desk, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial stage whisper that was still loud enough for those outside to hear. He gestured to the other agents. Hey, everybody, get a load of this guy. Several agents, eager to curry favor, wandered closer to the glass walls, their faces alight with cruel amusement. Davis turned his attention back to Marco, his audience now assembled. He was performing, and he loved it. This guy, this illegal alien we picked up for a busted taillight, he says he's a veteran, a 10-year veteran. A fresh wave of snickering rippled through the onlookers. The detainees in the main room averted their eyes, shrinking into themselves, the second-hand humiliation as potent as if it were directed at them. They knew the rules of this place. Do not draw attention. Do not make waves. Do not give the powerful a reason to notice you. Marco Reyes had just broken all 3 rules. Davis's face was now inches from Marco's. The sour smell of his coffee breath washed over him. Served what, huh? Served what, boy? Tacos from a food truck? Did you serve subpoenas for some sleazy lawyer? What did you serve? The word boy was a deliberate, calculated sting, designed to strip away the last vestiges of dignity from the man before him. Marco did not flinch. He did not recoil from the agent's invasive proximity. His gaze remained locked on Davis, but it was as if he were looking through him, at something far away. The noise, the laughter, the suffocating presence of the agent, it all seemed to fade into a distant hum. The granite core inside him held firm. He had faced down men with machine guns and rocket launchers, men whose eyes burned with genuine, murderous hatred. This bloated, preening bully was nothing. He was just noise. He was just a disappointment. "I served in the United States Army," Marco said, his voice quiet but now infused with a cold, hard clarity that cut through the agent's bluster. "Special Forces." For a heartbeat, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the claim silenced the room. The agents outside stopped snickering, their smiles frozen on their faces. They looked at each other, a flicker of confusion in their eyes. Special Forces? It was so specific, so outrageously, unbelievably specific. Then, as if on cue, Davis shattered the silence with another explosive laugh, this one even more derisive than the last. "Special Forces. Oh, now I've heard it all. Rambo here was in the Green Berets. What's next? You're a secret astronaut? The King of England?" Davis's face hardened, the performance over, replaced by a raw, vindictive anger. Marco's refusal to break, his quiet, maddening calm had pushed him over the edge. It felt like defiance, and Davis could not tolerate defiance. He straightened up and slammed his open palm down on the file on his desk. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "That's it. I'm done with you. You want to play games? Fine." His voice was low and menacing now, all traces of humor gone. Lying to a federal officer, contempt, obstruction. He was inventing charges, pulling them from the ether of his rage. "You think you're clever, don't you, you little punk?" Davis spat, his jowls trembling. "We're fast-tracking you. No hearing, no appeal. You're on the next flight to whatever hellhole you crawled out of. You'll be on a plane by sunrise, and you can tell all your friends back home about how you were a big, tough Green Beret." He jabbed a button on his desk intercom. "Get a couple of guards in here. I want this liar in solitary holding. Now." He looked at Marco with triumphant finality, a predator who had finally cornered his prey. But the prey did not look scared. He looked tired. He looked sad. And that, more than anything, infuriated Agent Davis beyond measure. Two burly guards entered the office, their expressions impassive. They moved to flank Marco, their hands resting on their belts. "On your feet," one of them grunted. Marco stood slowly, his movements still deliberate. He gave Agent Davis one last, long look, a look that held no anger, no fear, only a profound and weary disappointment. Then he turned and allowed the guards to lead him away. Davis, still breathing heavily, snatched Marco's file from the desk and stormed out of his office. He marched over to a long counter where several clerks were processing paperwork. He spotted a junior clerk, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, and slammed the file down in front of her, making her jump. "Jenkins, this one. Immediate removal. I want the paperwork done in an hour. No excuses." He glared at her, daring her to question him. Sarah Jenkins was small and quiet, with wide, intelligent eyes that saw more than she let on. She was 24, but a lifetime of responsibility had settled on her young shoulders. Before this civilian job, she had spent 4 years in the United States Air Force as a logistics specialist, a glorified-sounding title for a grueling job that involved tracking vast quantities of materiel and personnel across the globe. She had left the service to be closer to her ailing mother, taking this government job because it was stable and paid the bills. But she hated it. She hated the casual cruelty, the bureaucratic indifference, and most of all, she hated men like Agent Davis. She had watched the entire exchange in the glass-walled office. Davis's bullying had turned her stomach, but it was the man, Reyes, who had captured her attention. There was something in his posture, the way he held himself even when seated. It was a subtle thing, an economy of motion, a stillness under pressure that she recognized. She had seen it in grizzled NCOs at Bagram Airfield, men who had been in the thick of it for years. It was a look of profound competence, of a body and mind honed by extreme discipline. When he stood, she noticed he didn't quite lock his knees, a habit drilled into soldiers to prevent fainting during long formations. It was a small detail, almost invisible, but to her trained eye, it was a signal. Davis saw a lying immigrant. Sarah saw a soldier. Her disgust for Davis warred with a primal fear for her job. She needed this job. Her mother's medical bills were a mountain she was slowly trying to climb. But as she looked at the file, at the sneering, dismissive notes Davis had scrawled in the margins, subject is delusional. Claims to be SF, highly combative. A different kind of feeling began to burn in her chest. It was her own ingrained sense of duty, the part of her that the Air Force had forged, the part that screamed that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. A fellow veteran, if he was a veteran, was being railroaded, humiliated, and she was being ordered to facilitate it. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the file to begin typing. Tucked inside was a smaller Ziploc bag, the standard evidence bag for personal effects. The inventory form attached listed one item. 1. Small, round, worn metal token. Unknown significance. Davis had probably tossed it in there without a second glance. Trinket, contraband, garbage. Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. She carefully unzipped the bag and slid the object into her palm. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. It was made of some kind of brass or bronze, the features worn smooth by years of friction, probably from being carried in a pocket day in and day out. The metal was cool against her skin. Despite the wear, she could make out an emblem on one side, a pair of crossed arrows behind a dagger superimposed over a stylized shield. On the other side, she could just barely decipher an inscription encircling another emblem. Her blood went cold. She knew this insignia. Every service member, regardless of branch, knew this insignia. It was the crest of the U.S. Army Special Forces. Suddenly, Marco Reyes's claim wasn't absurd. It was terrifyingly plausible. This wasn't just a token. It was a challenge coin. In military culture, and especially in the elite world of special operations, a unit coin was not a mere trinket. It was a symbol of belonging, of shared hardship and sacrifice. It was often given out by a unit commander for a specific act of valor or achievement. It was proof. It was identity. It was sacred. To have it dismissed as a token by a man like Davis was a desecration. Sarah's heart began to pound against her ribs. What could she do? If she questioned Davis, he would fire her on the spot. He would shred her reputation and make sure she never got another government job. She could process the paperwork, keep her head down, and live with the shame. Or she could do something else, something risky, something insane. The image of Marco's calm, sad eyes flashed in her mind. She thought of the sergeants and officers she had served with, the ones who had taught her that integrity was not something you could turn on and off. It was either who you were, or it was not. She made a decision. It felt like stepping off a cliff. She quickly typed in Marco's basic information, creating a digital placeholder that would buy her some time. She looked around. Davis was holding court by the coffee machine, regaling his sycophants with a more embellished version of the story. No one was watching her. With the coin clutched tightly in her hand, she stood up and walked briskly toward the back of the office, heading for the supply closet as if on an urgent errand. Inside the cramped, windowless closet, surrounded by shelves of paper and toner cartridges, she pulled out her personal cell phone. The air was thick with the chemical smell of cleaning supplies. Her fingers felt numb and clumsy as she used her phone's browser to search for the insignia on the coin. 7th Special Forces Group, Airborne. The Red Empire, de oppresso liber, to free the oppressed. The unit's motto felt like a punch to the gut. She dug deeper, using search terms she remembered from her time in logistics, navigating through public-facing sites to find a hint of an internal directory. It was a long shot. But she found a reference on a veteran forum, a post discussing a unit reunion that mentioned the name of the current command sergeant major of the 7th Group. It wasn't a phone number, just a name. With that name, she took another gamble. She logged into a restricted government personnel locator system she still had access to, a leftover from her military clearance that IT had never bothered to revoke. Her heart hammered as she typed. It was a fireable offense, a potential federal crime, but she didn't care anymore. A result appeared. Command Sergeant Major Robert Miller. Office number at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Her breath hitched. This was it. The point of no return. Her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone steady, she dialed the number. She listened to the ring, each one an eternity. What would she say? How could she explain this without sounding like a lunatic? Meanwhile, in the cold, gray box of the solitary holding cell, Marco Reyes sat on the edge of a concrete slab that served as a bed. The guards had been rough, shoving him inside and slamming the heavy steel door with a clang that echoed the finality of his situation. The cell was bare. A toilet, a sink, and the slab. A single, dim light bulb glowed from behind a thick wire mesh in the ceiling. The air was cold and smelled of damp concrete and disinfectant. For the first time that day, Marco allowed his composure to crack, but only on the inside. He closed his eyes, and the gray walls of the cell dissolved. The smell of bleach was replaced by the acrid metallic scent of cordite and the thick, choking dust of a foreign land. The hum of the fluorescent light became the high-pitched whine of incoming rounds. He was no longer in a detention center in America. He was back in the Sangin Valley, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The graveyard of empires. He felt the familiar, crushing weight of his body armor and gear, the rough canvas strap of his rifle cutting into his shoulder. He could hear the voice of Sergeant Tom Preacher Bellamy, his team's medic, cracking jokes over the comms just moments before everything went to hell. He remembered the ambush. The sudden, deafening explosion of an IED that had crippled their lead vehicle, followed instantly by a torrent of machine gun fire from a ridge they had thought was clear. They were caught in a kill zone, a perfectly executed L-shaped ambush. He remembered the feeling of helplessness as he saw their team captain, a young, brilliant officer named Michael Vance, go down, his leg mangled by shrapnel. He remembered Bellamy being hit as he tried to crawl to the captain. Panic. Chaos. The air filled with screams and the relentless, deafening chatter of enemy fire. They were pinned down, outnumbered, and their leadership was out of commission. It was a death sentence. But Marco had been born for chaos. While others froze, his mind went cold and clear. He was not a U.S. citizen then, just a legal permanent resident who had enlisted under a little-known program called Military Accessions Vital to the National Interest, or MAVNI. It promised expedited citizenship in exchange for critical skills. His critical skill was his language. He was fluent in multiple Pashto dialects, and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm and lethal under fire. He had been promised a country, and in that moment he decided he was going to earn it. He remembered laying down a blistering field of suppressive fire, changing positions with a speed and agility that made one man sound like three. He remembered crawling under the hail of bullets, dragging Captain Vance and then Bellamy into the meager cover of a shallow ditch. He remembered using his own body to shield the captain when a grenade landed nearby, the searing heat and violent concussion of the blast washing over him. The shrapnel had torn into his back and side, a pain so white-hot it was almost abstract. But he didn't stop. He got on the radio, his voice impossibly calm, and called in a danger-close airstrike, guiding the A-10 Warthogs onto the enemy positions with terrifying precision. He held the line. Single-handedly, for what felt like an eternity, He was the only thing standing between his team and annihilation. Weeks later, in a hospital bed at Landstuhl, Germany, a recovering Captain Vance had visited him. With him was the theater commander, a two-star general. The general had pinned a silver star to his hospital gown. Captain Vance had pressed a heavy coin into his hand. "You saved us, Marco," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of us. Don't you ever forget what you did." The coin was from the 7th Special Forces Group. The promise of citizenship was renewed, fast-tracked for his valor. But promises made in the theater of war often died in the labyrinth of peacetime bureaucracy. His paperwork was lost. His advocate at the Pentagon retired. After 10 years of honorable service, culminating in a medical discharge for the injuries he sustained that day, Sergeant First Class Marco Reyes found himself a civilian again, but the citizenship he had bled for never materialized. He was a hero without a country. The coin was all he had left. It wasn't a trophy. It was a memorial, a reminder of the men he fought alongside, the promise he had kept, and the promise that had been broken. He opened his eyes. The gray walls of the cell returned. The sadness that washed over him was immense, a quiet, fathomless ocean. Back in the supply closet, a voice answered the phone. It was gruff, impatient, and sounded like it was filtered through gravel. "Sergeant Major Miller." Sarah's own voice came out as a squeak. She cleared her throat. "Sergeant Major," she began, her words tumbling out in a frantic, hushed torrent. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm a civilian clerk at the ICE facility in El Paso. I'm an Air Force veteran. Sir, there's a man here. They're about to deport him. His name is Marco Reyes. He says he served in the 7th Group." She was babbling, but she couldn't stop. The agent in charge, he laughed at him. "He's put him in solitary. But, sir, he has a coin. He has a 7th Group challenge coin. They took it from him." There was a long, dead silence on the other end of the line. For a terrible moment, Sarah thought he had hung up, that he thought she was a crank. Then the voice returned, but it had changed. The impatience was gone, replaced by a deadly, focused intensity. "Describe the man." Sarah described Marco as best she could. The weathered face, the quiet demeanor, the steady eyes. "Describe the coin," the voice commanded. She detailed the worn brass, the crossed arrows, the dagger. She tried to read the faint inscription. D. Oppresso. Liber. Another silence, shorter this time. Then, 2 words spoken with the force of a tectonic plate shifting. "Stay put." The line went dead. Sarah sagged against a shelf of paper reams, her legs feeling like jelly. She didn't know if she had just saved a man or destroyed her own life. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Command Sergeant Major Robert Miller lowered the phone. His face, a mask of hardened leather from 3 decades of service, was grim. He knew the name Marco Reyes. Every operator in the 7th Group from that era knew the name. Reyes was a legend, a ghost, a soldier's soldier who had vanished into the civilian world after his discharge. To hear he was in an ICE detention cell, being mocked and processed for deportation, was not just an injustice, it was a sacrilege. Miller didn't hesitate. He didn't make another call. He strode out of his office, his movements precise and powerful, and walked directly toward the office of the commanding officer of the entire U.S. Army Special Operations Command. He walked past the general's aide, a young, fresh-faced captain who started to protest, then wisely shut his mouth at the look on the sergeant major's face. He knocked once on the general's door and entered without waiting for a reply. Major General Michael Vance looked up from the report he was reading. He was older now, the boyish captain's face replaced by the stern, authoritative features of a 2-star general. A thin scar ran along his jawline, a souvenir from Sanguine. He saw his sergeant major, and he knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. "Bob?" "General," Miller said, his voice tight. "We have a problem. A ghost from Sanguine has reappeared. Sergeant First Class Marco Reyes. He's in an ICE facility in El Paso. They're deporting him." The general's face went through a rapid series of transformations. Confusion, disbelief, and then a slow-burning rage that made the air in the room feel thin and cold. The report in his hand was forgotten. He stood up, his full 6'3" frame rigid with fury. Marco Reyes. The man who had saved his life. The man to whom he owed his career, his family, his very existence. Being treated like garbage by some jumped-up bureaucrat. "Get the jet ready," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Then he picked up a secure red telephone on his desk, a direct line to the highest levels of the Pentagon. "Get me the Secretary of the Army," he barked into the receiver, "and then get me the Secretary of Homeland Security. This is not a request." Protocols were not being bypassed. They were being vaporized. Less than 3 hours later, the main entrance of the El Paso ICE Processing Center burst open. It wasn't a violent, explosive entry, but a display of such controlled, overwhelming force that it was far more terrifying. 2 men in immaculate dark suits and sunglasses, earpieces discreetly coiled behind their ears, stepped inside first. Their heads swiveled, their eyes scanning every corner of the room with a cold, predatory efficiency that made the armed ICE agents look like mall cops. They were the advance team. The room fell silent. The hum of the light suddenly seemed deafening. Then they entered. The first was Command Sergeant Major Robert Miller, his uniform a symphony of sharp creases and gleaming brass. His chest was a billboard of military history, a testament to a life lived at the sharp end of the spear. Flanking him, walking with a stride that consumed the floor, was Major General Michael Vance. His own Class A uniform was a constellation of heroism. The deep blue of the Distinguished Service Cross was prominent, just above a silver star and a purple heart. His 2 stars glittered on his shoulders like chips of ice. Their polished black boots clicked on the cheap linoleum floor, a rhythmic, inexorable sound, like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Every agent, every clerk, every detainee was frozen, held captive by the sheer, unadulterated authority that had just flooded the room. Agent Carl Davis, who had been laughing with a colleague near the vending machines, turned, his face a mask of confusion and irritation. Who were these people? Soldiers. What did they want? He puffed out his chest, his ingrained arrogance overriding the nascent sense of dread that was beginning to prickle his skin. He started to walk toward them, ready to assert his authority. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he began, his voice attempting its usual boom but coming out slightly strained. "This is a restricted federal facility. You can't just—" He was cut off mid-sentence. General Vance's eyes, as cold and hard as diamonds, swept over him and dismissed him in the same instant. He looked at Davis as if he were not a man but a piece of furniture, an obstacle to be navigated around. The general did not break stride. He continued walking directly toward the holding cells at the back of the facility, the sergeant major and the suited agents falling into formation around him. The public, brutal snub hung in the air, a slap in the face more potent than any physical blow. Davis froze in place, his mouth slightly agape, his face beginning to flush a deep, mortified red. The procession stopped in front of the solitary holding cell. A young, terrified-looking guard stood there, his hand hovering near his sidearm. The command sergeant major didn't even look at him. He simply barked an order, his voice cracking like a whip in the silent room. "Open it! Now!" The guard fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key into the lock. The heavy door swung open with a metallic groan. Marco Reyes looked up from the concrete slab, his eyes blinking against the sudden brightness. He saw the uniforms, the polished brass, the stern, familiar faces. He saw the 2 stars on the general's shoulders. He saw the captain he had pulled from the fire, now a leader of men. A flicker of recognition, of disbelief, crossed his face. General Vance and Sergeant Major Miller took one look at the man in the cell, the quiet hero, the living legend, now dressed in worn civilian clothes and sitting in a cage like an animal. and their rage coalesced into a single, powerful act of profound respect. They snapped to the most rigid, immaculate position of attention. Their spines were ramrod straight, their hands fixed at their sides. It was a gesture of deference reserved for the highest echelons of command or for a fallen comrade. In this context, it was a thunderclap. The general's voice rang out, sharp and clear, echoing through the cavernous space. It was not a question. It was a coronation. Sergeant First Class Marco Reyes. Slowly, Marco rose to his feet. He stood before them, a forgotten soldier being summoned back into the light. The general held the position of attention for a moment longer, a silent apology and a declaration of allegiance. Then he relaxed, but his eyes remained fixed on Marco. A deep, unspoken understanding passed between the two men, a bond forged in the crucible of combat that no amount of time or bureaucracy could ever break. Then the general turned. He turned his gaze upon Agent Carl Davis, who was still standing dumbly in the middle of the room. The full, focused, unrestrained fury of a two-star general who had just seen one of his finest men dishonored now fell upon him like a physical weight. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "You," the general said, his voice low, but it carried with absolute authority to every corner of the silent facility. He took a slow step toward Davis, who involuntarily took a step back. "You are the agent in charge here?" Davis swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as desert sand. Yes, sir. General, Agent Carl Davis. There seems to be some kind of misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding." The general cut him off, his voice like grinding steel. He pointed a finger back toward the cell where Marco now stood, flanked by the sergeant major. "This man," he began, his voice rising in volume and intensity, a prosecutor delivering his final damning summation to a captive jury, "is Sergeant First Class Marco Reyes. For 10 years, he was an operator in the 7th Special Forces Group, an 18B, a Special Forces weapons sergeant. He is a recipient of the Silver Star for Valor, 2 Bronze Stars with V devices, and the Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat." He took another deliberate step toward the shrinking agent. The crowd of agents and clerks were statues, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They were beginning to understand the magnitude of what had happened here. On the night of October 14th, 2012, the general continued, his voice resonating with the terrible clarity of lived history. "In a valley in Helmand Province, so godforsaken I'm surprised it's on a map. Then, Staff Sergeant Reyes's team was ambushed by a numerically superior enemy force. Their team leader was killed. Their medic was critically wounded." He paused, letting the grim reality of the words sink into the sterile air. Sergeant Reyes, though wounded himself, held off a platoon-sized assault single-handedly after his team was pinned down. He coordinated air support while under continuous direct fire. He saved the lives of 5 American soldiers that night. The general stopped directly in front of Davis, who now looked physically ill. He tapped the Distinguished Service Cross on his own chest. "I wear this medal because of that operation. I was the captain he pulled out of the kill zone. I was the man he shielded with his own body from a grenade blast. He saved my life." The revelation landed with the force of a physical explosion. The air was sucked out of the room. The agent who had mocked a hero had just been confronted by the hero he had saved. It was a moment of pure, devastating, cinematic justice. The general's eyes, blazing with a righteous fire, bored into Davis. "You," he whispered, the sound more menacing than any shout, "confiscated his personal property, a challenge coin given to him by his brothers in arms. You called it a trinket." He leaned in, his voice dropping even lower, a lethal hiss of contempt. "That trinket, Agent Davis, represents a measure of courage and sacrifice you couldn't possibly comprehend in 1,000 lifetimes. It is worth more than you. It is worth more than your entire, pathetic career." Davis's face had gone from red to a ghastly, pasty white. Sweat beaded on his forehead and upper lip. He tried to speak, but only a dry, croaking sound emerged. "You called him boy," the general continued, his voice a litany of Davis's sins. "You mocked his service to this nation, a service more profound and more meaningful than anything you have ever done. You sat in your comfortable chair, in your climate-controlled office, and you passed judgment on a man who has bled for the very freedoms you so casually abuse." The general turned his head slightly, addressing one of the suited men who had entered with him. "Get the Secretary of Homeland Security on the line. Now, and then get the United States Attorney for the Western District of Texas. Inform them that a federal agent of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, one Carl Davis, has unlawfully detained, abused, and violated the civil rights of a decorated combat veteran of the United States Army. A national hero. I want him prosecuted. I want him disbarred from federal service. I want his pension revoked. I want him to face the fullest consequences of the law. Is that understood?" "Yes, General," the aide replied crisply, already dialing on his satellite phone. At that moment, two men in the uniforms of the military police, who had entered silently and positioned themselves near the door, began to walk purposefully toward Agent Davis. He saw them coming, saw the handcuffs dangling from one of their belts, and a look of pure animal panic crossed his face. He looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route from the consequences of his own actions. But there was none. The MPs reached him. One of them calmly relieved him of his sidearm while the other instructed him to place his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut was the only sound in the dead silent room. Carl Davis, the king of the castle, had been dethroned and shackled in the middle of his own kingdom. He seemed to shrink, the swagger gone, the uniform now looking like a cheap costume on a broken man. The director of the facility, a balding man with a perpetually worried expression, finally unfroze. He scurried over, his face pale and slick with sweat, wringing his hands. "General Vance, sir. A terrible, terrible misunderstanding. A clerical error. The paperwork. We had no idea. If we had known—" He stammered, his words tripping over each other in a desperate attempt to distance himself from the disaster. General Vance cut him off with a look so cold, so utterly contemptuous, it could have frozen fire. "Your ignorance is not an excuse, Director. It is a failure of command," the general stated, his voice flat and final. "This facility, and your leadership, will be the subject of a full Inspector General investigation, effective immediately. Consider yourself relieved of duty pending its outcome." The director looked as if he had been struck by lightning, his mouth opening and closing silently. The immediate reversal was absolute. The charges were gone. The deportation order was vapor. The entire edifice of Davis's petty tyranny had been demolished in a matter of minutes. The sergeant major walked over to Marco, who had watched the entire scene unfold with that same weary sadness in his eyes. Miller gently placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of profound solidarity. "Let's go home, Sergeant," he said softly. They began to escort Marco out of the facility. But he was not walking as a detainee. He was walking as an honored guest, flanked by a 2-star general and a command sergeant major, the living symbols of the nation's might now acting as his personal honor guard. As they passed Sarah Jenkins' desk, she looked up, tears of relief and terror streaming down her face. She had been sure she was going to be fired, or worse. General Vance paused for a fraction of a second. His eyes met hers. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture that carried a universe of meaning. "I know what you did. You did the right thing. Thank you." In that moment, Sarah knew her life had just changed forever. As the MPS led the cuffed and broken Carl Davis away, his path intersected with Marco's. Davis looked up, his eyes pleading, desperate, searching for— what? Forgiveness? Pity? An ounce of compassion? Marco looked back at him. There was no triumph on his face, no smirk of victory, no satisfaction in seeing his tormentor brought low. There was only that deep, profound sorrow. He gave a slow, almost invisible shake of his head. It was not a gesture of denial, but of sheer, unadulterated disappointment. It was a final judgment, more damning and more devastating than any shout of anger or word of condemnation could ever be. It said, "This is what you are," and it is a tragedy. The fallout was swift and brutal. Carl Davis was fired before General Vance's jet had even touched back down in North Carolina. He was indicted by federal grand jury a month later on charges of abuse of authority, making false statements, and deprivation of rights under color of law. His union refused to represent him. His colleagues, who had laughed at his jokes, now pretended they barely knew him. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 18 months in a federal penitentiary. He lost everything: his job, his pension, his reputation, his family's respect. His name became a verb in federal law enforcement circles. To pull a Davis was to commit an act of such monumental, career-ending stupidity, driven by pure ego, that it became a cautionary tale for generations of agents to come. The Marco Reyes incident, as it became known in classified government reports, sent a seismic shockwave through the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. It exposed a gaping, shameful flaw in the system. A joint task force was immediately convened. Within 6 months, Congress passed a bipartisan bill known as the Reyes Act. The act established a new, permanent liaison office within DHS, staffed by both immigration experts and military veterans, with the sole purpose of handling all immigration and naturalization cases involving non-citizen service members and veterans. Their records were now automatically cross-referenced with the Pentagon's, ensuring that a hero could never again be mistaken for a criminal. The ICE facility in El Paso was subjected to a top-to-bottom command overhaul, and new mandatory training programs on military cultural competency were implemented nationwide. Sarah Jenkins, the young clerk who had made the call, was summoned to Washington, D.C. She expected a reprimand for her unauthorized use of government systems. Instead, she was met by a smiling General Vance, who presented her with a Distinguished Civilian Service Medal. He then offered her a job, a senior position in the newly formed Reyes Act Liaison Office. She accepted without hesitation. She left the world of processing and removal behind and became a fierce, tireless advocate for the very people she had once been tasked with deporting, finding a purpose that redeemed her past and defined her future. 2 years passed. On a quiet, sunny afternoon in a peaceful suburban neighborhood near Fort Bragg, a man waited nervously on the sidewalk. He was thinner now, his face etched with a permanent anxiety. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out humility. It was Carl Davis. He had served his time and was trying to piece his life back together. He saw the front door of a small, neat house open, and Marco Reyes stepped out to check his mail. Davis took a deep, shaky breath and approached him, his head bowed. "Mr. Reyes," he began, his voice raspy. Marco stopped and looked at him, his expression patient, unreadable. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," Davis stammered. "What I did, it was unforgivable. I was arrogant. I was a bully. There's no excuse. I lost everything, and I deserved to. I had to find you and tell you that to your face." He didn't ask for forgiveness, he just stood there, a broken man offering the shards of his apology. Marco's path had changed dramatically. Within a month of the incident, his citizenship case was not just resolved, it was celebrated. In a special ceremony at the White House with the President and the Secretary of Defense in attendance, General Michael Vance had personally presented him with his naturalization certificate. He now had the country he had fought for. He didn't return to a quiet life of labor. Instead, he found a new mission. He worked for a nonprofit organization, using his own harrowing experience to help other veterans, citizen and non-citizen alike, navigate the bewildering maze of the VA and immigration systems. He was still a quiet man, but his voice now carried the weight of authority and experience. He listened to Davis's halting confession, his gaze never leaving the former agent's face. When Davis fell silent, Marco considered his words for a long moment. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. "Forgiveness is not mine to give," Marco said finally, his voice as calm and even as it had been in that sterile office 2 years ago. "The person you need forgiveness from is the man you were supposed to be, the public servant you swore an oath to be. That is a debt you owe to yourself." He looked at the former agent, seeing not a monster, but a man consumed and destroyed by his own worst impulses. "Your apology is just words, Mr. Davis. Words are easy. What matters is what you do now. From this day forward, go and be a better man. Go and build something instead of tearing things down." With that, Marco Reyes nodded once, turned, and walked back into his house, leaving Carl Davis alone on the sidewalk. He had not offered absolution. He had not offered friendship or pity. He had offered something far more valuable and far more difficult, a path to redemption that was Davis's, and his alone, to walk. Marco closed his front door, the quiet click echoing in the peaceful afternoon air. The battle was over. The war was won. His honor was restored, and he was finally, truly home.